Have you ever felt trapped by fear, as if it was controlling your every decision? What if I told you that everything you've ever believed about fear, why it exists, how it works, and how to conquer it is wrong? Imagine living a life where fear no longer dictates your choices, where failure, rejection, and uncertainty no longer have the power to hold you back. What if there was a way to break free, to reclaim your mind, and to experience true freedom, not the illusion of control, but the deep, unshakable peace that comes from understanding reality itself? Today, we're diving into the mind of one of the greatest thinkers in history, Baruch Spinoza. He was a man who had no political power, no great wealth, and no widespread recognition in his time. He was excommunicated from his own religious community, abandoned by family and friends, and forced to live a modest, isolated life as a lens grinder. And yet, despite all of this, Spinoza achieved something that even kings and emperors failed to grasp: absolute freedom. Not the kind of freedom that comes from wealth or influence, but a deeper, more profound liberation. Freedom from fear, from anxiety, and from the illusions that enslave the human mind. His ideas were so dangerous that they were banned, censored, and even erased from history for centuries. Why? Because Spinoza uncovered a truth that threatened the foundations of religion, politics, and even human identity. He saw through the lies that keep people trapped in fear, and he found the key to unlocking a fearless, enlightened life. And today, we're going to explore exactly what that key is. But before we begin, I need you to do something. If you're ready to challenge everything you've ever known about fear, hit that like button to let me know you're with me. And if you want to keep diving into powerful ideas like this, subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss out. Also, if you find value in what I share, consider donating through Super Thanks to support the channel and help us continue creating content like this. Your support keeps these life-changing ideas alive and accessible for everyone. Now, get ready, because what you're about to hear could change the way you see the world forever. Fear has been a fundamental aspect of human experience for as long as history records. It influences decisions, molds societies, and, when used strategically, serves as an effective tool for control. But why do people so readily succumb to fear? The answer is not merely psychological, it is deeply woven into the structures of power that have long governed the world. Governments, religious institutions, and media entities have consistently leveraged fear to manipulate human emotions and behaviors, ensuring compliance, obedience, and dependency. Throughout history, fear has been a political weapon. Consider the Cold War era, during which the United States and the Soviet Union used the looming threat of nuclear annihilation to justify aggressive policies, surveillance measures, and military expansion. Fear wasn't merely a reaction to external threats, it was actively cultivated. The American government, for example, instilled the fear of communist infiltration so deeply into the public psyche that citizens were willing to accept extreme measures, such as McCarthyist purges, that eroded civil liberties. More recently, the War on Terror exemplifies how fear can be utilized to expand governmental control. In the wake of 9/11, legislation like the Patriot Act was passed with little resistance from the public, who prioritized safety over individual freedoms. The perception of constant danger allowed the government to implement widespread surveillance programs that, under normal circumstances, would have been fiercely opposed. Religious institutions, too, have long recognized the utility of fear in maintaining order and authority. The concept of divine punishment, eternal damnation, or bad karma has been used across cultures to enforce moral codes. In medieval Europe, the Catholic Church wielded fear effectively. Excommunication was not just a spiritual sentence but a social and economic death. Those who questioned religious doctrine were not only at risk of being condemned to hell but also ostracized from their communities. The fear of heresy ensured adherence to religious laws, often not out of genuine belief but out of dread of the consequences of defiance. The media, in modern times, has refined the art of fear-mongering. The principle of, if it bleeds, it leads, ensures that the most alarming and emotionally charged stories dominate headlines. News outlets and social media platforms thrive on sensationalism, creating a culture where fear is constantly reinforced. Consider crime rates. Despite statistical evidence that violent crime has significantly decreased in many parts of the world, The perception of danger remains high because of the way crime is reported. Dramatic and isolated incidents are presented as indicative of a larger crisis, stoking paranoia and influencing public sentiment toward more stringent law enforcement policies. Baruch Spinoza, one of the most radical thinkers of the 17th century, saw through this cycle of fear and control, living in an era when questioning religious authority was perilous. He understood how fear dictated human behavior. However, he also believed that fear was not an intrinsic part of existence but rather a consequence of ignorance. Spinoza argued that people do not suffer from external events themselves, but from their perception and interpretation of those events. This distinction is critical because it shifts control from external circumstances to internal understanding. Spinoza's insights offer a liberating perspective. If fear is a mental construct, then it can be deconstructed through reason and knowledge. By comprehending the laws that govern reality, whether through philosophy, science, or self-awareness, people can dismantle irrational fears. He emphasized the deterministic nature of existence, asserting that everything happens according to natural laws. When individuals recognize that many aspects of life are beyond their control, they can stop resisting reality and instead focus on understanding it. This does not mean adopting passivity but rather embracing intellectual freedom. Instead of fearing the unknown, Spinoza challenges people to seek knowledge and clarity. Consider public speaking, one of the most common modern fears. Anxiety over speaking in front of an audience stems not from the act itself but from imagined consequences, embarrassment, rejection, or failure. Through Spinoza's lens, this fear is an exaggeration. If a speaker stumbles over their words, does it result in catastrophe? Or is it simply a moment in time that holds little significance in the grand scheme of life? Recognizing the distortion of fear allows individuals to approach challenges with reason rather than emotional distress. Beyond everyday anxieties, Spinoza's philosophy applies to profound existential fears: death, failure, and rejection. Fear of death often stems from the illusion that life should be prolonged indefinitely rather than understood as part of the natural order. Fear of failure arises when individuals believe outcomes should align with personal desires rather than unfolding according to larger causal chains. Fear of rejection is rooted in an over-reliance on external validation instead of self-sufficiency. By reframing these fears as misunderstandings rather than unavoidable burdens, individuals can liberate themselves from unnecessary suffering. This shift in perception is transformative. If individuals and societies can learn to see fear as a mental construct rather than an unavoidable reality, the power structures that use fear as leverage begin to weaken. This is not to say that fear should be ignored, rather, it should be critically examined. Fear, when approached with reason, becomes an indicator rather than a dictator. It can inform decisions without controlling them. The objective is not to eliminate fear entirely but to understand it so that it no longer dominates one's life. Spinoza's ideas remain profoundly relevant in an era where fear is amplified by rapid information cycles, political instability, and societal pressures. His philosophy is an antidote to manipulation, a call to intellectual independence, a rejection of blind obedience to fear-driven narratives, and an invitation to seek clarity over confusion. By adopting his approach, individuals can reclaim autonomy over their perceptions and, ultimately, their lives. In a world where fear is systematically used as a means of control, Spinoza's wisdom offers a reminder that true freedom begins in the mind. Baruch Spinoza was born in 1632 in Amsterdam, into a Sephardic Jewish community that had fled the Spanish and Portuguese Inquisitions. His family, like many others in the Jewish diaspora, sought refuge in the relatively tolerant Dutch Republic, where commerce and intellectual life were flourishing. However, despite Amsterdam's reputation for religious tolerance, the Jewish community itself was tightly controlled by its own religious leaders, who sought to maintain orthodoxy and prevent dissent. Spinoza, from a young age, exhibited an inquisitive mind, one that would eventually lead him to challenge the very foundations of the religious doctrines that governed his community. His upbringing was steeped in Jewish tradition, with an education focused on the Hebrew Bible, Talmudic studies, and the philosophical commentaries of figures like Maimonides. However, he also had access to a broader intellectual climate that exposed him to new ideas, particularly those stemming from the scientific revolution and the rationalist movement sweeping across Europe. Figures like René Descartes and Francis Bacon had begun questioning the reliance on religious authority and dogma, advocating for reason and empirical observation as the primary means of understanding the world. Spinoza, ever the independent thinker, found himself drawn to these new approaches, leading him to question the foundations of not only Judaism but religious belief as a whole. This questioning did not go unnoticed. By his early 20s, Spinoza was already engaging in discussions that unsettled the religious authorities of his community. He rejected the traditional anthropomorphic view of God as a divine being that rewarded and punished human actions, instead proposing that God was synonymous with nature itself, a fundamental, all-encompassing reality governed by immutable laws. This view, later expounded in his philosophical masterwork Ethics, directly contradicted the core teachings of Judaism, Christianity, and virtually all organized religions, which depended on the idea of a personal deity actively involved in human affairs. His radical ideas could not be tolerated by the leaders of Amsterdam's Jewish community. In 1656, at the age of just 23, Spinoza was issued a cherem, a form of excommunication that was as severe as it was rare. The declaration was absolute, cursing him in the harshest possible terms and forbidding anyone in the community from speaking to or even acknowledging his existence. He was, in essence, erased from Jewish life, condemned to wander without the support of his people, unlike later excommunications, which were sometimes reversible upon repentance. Spinoza's was final. He was permanently cast out, unable to return to the faith of his ancestors. For many, such a punishment would have been devastating. Family, friends, and social networks were the bedrock of survival, especially in a world where religious identity determined one's place in society. To be excommunicated was to lose not just one's community but often one's means of livelihood. Yet, Spinoza did not seem to mourn his exile in the way one might expect. Instead of seeking readmission or lamenting his fate, he embraced his newfound independence as an opportunity. He left behind the restrictions of religious orthodoxy and began to carve out a new intellectual path, free from the constraints of dogma. In order to support himself, Spinoza turned to a modest trade, lens grinding. This was no small task. Working with precision to create lenses for microscopes and telescopes required skill and patience. It was also a profession closely linked to the burgeoning scientific revolution. Figures like Galileo and Antony van Leeuwenhoek were making groundbreaking discoveries using lenses similar to those Spinoza crafted. His work in optics allowed him not only to earn a living but also to remain immersed in scientific inquiry, a passion that paralleled his philosophical pursuits. Despite his isolation, Spinoza did not retreat from intellectual engagement. He began writing, corresponding with some of the most prominent thinkers of his time, including Henry Oldenburg, a key figure in the Royal Society of London. These exchanges allowed Spinoza to refine his ideas and solidify his position as one of the leading rationalist philosophers of the age. His letters, many of which have been preserved, reveal a man deeply committed to the pursuit of truth, unafraid to challenge established beliefs, and unwilling to compromise his intellectual integrity for the sake of social acceptance. What made Spinoza's philosophy so revolutionary was not just its rejection of religious orthodoxy but its radical redefinition of God, free will, and human nature. He argued that everything in the universe, including human thoughts and actions, was determined by natural laws. There was no divine intervention, no miracles, and no supernatural forces guiding human destiny. Instead, everything followed a necessary order, governed by the same principles that dictated the movement of planets and the growth of plants. This deterministic view of reality was profoundly unsettling to those who believed in a God that responded to prayers and rewarded or punished individuals based on their moral choices. Yet, Spinoza saw this understanding as liberating rather than nihilistic. If human beings were not subject to the whims of a capricious deity, they could strive for true freedom, not the illusory freedom of arbitrary choice, but the deeper freedom that comes from understanding and accepting the natural order of things. For Spinoza, the path to happiness was not found in seeking divine favor or fearing divine wrath, but in cultivating reason, embracing knowledge, and aligning oneself with the inherent logic of the universe. His philosophical journey was not without danger. His ideas were considered so controversial that even those outside the Jewish community viewed him with suspicion. He refused a prestigious academic position at the University of Heidelberg because he feared it would limit his ability to think and write freely. When his works began circulating, they were met with outrage. His theological political treatise, published anonymously in 1670, was condemned by religious and political authorities alike. It was considered so dangerous that it was officially banned in many parts of Europe. Yet, despite the opposition, Spinoza continued his work. He spent the rest of his life refining his ethics, a work that would not be published until after his death in 1677. In it, he presented his most complete vision of the world, a world in which emotions could be understood through reason, in which fear could be overcome by knowledge, and in which the pursuit of truth was the highest human endeavor. Spinoza's legacy is remarkable not just for its intellectual depth but for its courage. At a time when deviating from religious orthodoxy could lead to social ruin or worse, he chose the path of radical honesty. He accepted his exile and transformed it into an opportunity, using his solitude to develop one of the most profound and enduring philosophical systems in Western thought. Today, his influence can be seen in countless areas of philosophy, political theory, and even science. His ideas about determinism foreshadowed modern discussions on neuroscience and psychology. His rejection of anthropomorphic deity paved the way for more secular understandings of ethics and morality. And his insistence on intellectual freedom continues to inspire those who resist dogma in favor of rational inquiry. Spinoza's story is a testament to the power of independent thought. It serves as a reminder that the price of truth can be high, but the rewards, clarity, understanding, and a deeper connection to reality are immeasurable. In a world still dominated by fear, superstition, and ideological rigidity, his philosophy remains as relevant as ever, offering a blueprint for those who seek not comfort in illusion, but strength in understanding. Baruch Spinoza's ideas were too radical for his time, too disruptive to the established order, and too dangerous to be tolerated by the religious authorities of his community. His rejection of the traditional concept of God, his insistence that everything in the universe followed necessary laws rather than divine intervention, and his refusal to adhere to religious orthodoxy made him a pariah. His excommunication from the Jewish community in Amsterdam was not just a theological dispute, it was an act of total social and personal erasure. The cherem issued against him was severe, cursing him in the harshest possible terms, forbidding anyone from speaking to him, and essentially declaring that he was to be forgotten. His former friends turned their backs on him, his family abandoned him, and he was left without a place in the only world he had ever known. For many, this kind of social and familial rejection would have been unbearable. In the tightly knit Jewish community of 17th century Amsterdam, expulsion meant not only spiritual condemnation but also economic hardship and isolation. A person cut off from the community lost access to business networks, religious services, and even basic social interactions. This was a world in which identity was deeply intertwined with religious belonging. To be excommunicated was to be rendered invisible, a fate that, for most, would lead to despair or a desperate attempt at repentance and reintegration. But Spinoza, instead of seeking to regain favor, took a different path. He accepted his exile not as a punishment, but as a form of liberation. This ability to transform personal loss into philosophical clarity is what makes Spinoza one of the most remarkable thinkers in history. Rather than allowing bitterness or self-pity to consume him, he saw his isolation as an opportunity to develop a completely new way of thinking. He was now free from the expectations of religious dogma, free from the need to conform to traditional beliefs, and free from the constraints that had once shaped his life. He did not seek to build a new religious following or to challenge the authorities directly. Instead, he dedicated himself to an intellectual pursuit that would redefine how humanity understood God, nature, and itself. To support himself, he took up lens grinding, a meticulous trade that required patience and precision. It was an appropriate occupation for a man who saw the world through the lens of reason, always searching for greater clarity. His work in optics was not just a means of survival, it connected him to the scientific advancements of his time. He was living in an era of profound scientific discovery, where thinkers like Galileo, Descartes, and Newton were challenging old ways of understanding the universe. The precision required in grinding lenses mirrored the intellectual rigor with which he approached philosophy. Each finely crafted lens was a symbol of his approach to knowledge and attempt to bring things into sharper focus, to remove distortions, and to see reality as it truly was. Despite his isolation, Spinoza did not completely withdraw from intellectual society. He engaged in correspondence with some of the greatest minds of the time, exchanging letters with philosophers, scientists, and political thinkers. His ideas were considered so controversial that he often published anonymously to avoid persecution. Even those who admired his work were hesitant to associate with him openly, fearing the repercussions of being linked to someone whose views were seen as heretical. But Spinoza remained undeterred. He saw philosophy not as a way to gain power or prestige but as a means to understand the fundamental nature of existence. What made Spinoza's philosophy so revolutionary was that he did not simply reject religious authority. He replaced it with a completely different understanding of God and the universe. To him, God was not a personal being who intervened in human affairs but rather the very substance of reality itself. Everything that existed was an expression of God, governed by the same immutable laws that governed the motion of the planets and the growth of plants. This was a radical departure from the traditional view of a deity who could be petitioned with prayers, who dispensed rewards and punishments, and who had a will separate from nature. Spinoza's God did not make decisions, did not respond to human actions, and did not exist outside of the universe. Instead, God was the universe, inseparable from the laws that dictated its functioning. This idea was profoundly unsettling to both religious and secular authorities. If God was simply the sum total of existence, then what was the purpose of religious institutions? If everything followed a necessary order, then what role did free will play? If the universe was not governed by divine justice but by impersonal laws, then what did that mean for morality? Spinoza's answers to these questions were as unsettling as they were transformative. He argued that human beings did not suffer because of divine punishment but because of their own misunderstandings of reality. Fear, anxiety, and suffering were not external afflictions imposed by a higher power. They were the result of ignorance and misplaced desires. This perspective had profound ethical implications. If people truly understood the necessary nature of reality, they would no longer live in fear of divine wrath. They would stop blaming fate for their misfortunes and instead seek to align themselves with the fundamental truths of existence. True freedom, according to Spinoza, was not the ability to choose arbitrarily but the ability to act in accordance with reason and necessity. A person who understood the world as it truly was would not be ruled by passions, would not be swayed by superstition, and would not be enslaved by fear. His rejection of traditional notions of free will was another reason he was seen as dangerous. Most religious traditions are built on the idea that humans are moral agents who freely choose between good and evil, and that divine judgment is based on these choices. But Spinoza saw this as an illusion. People do not make choices in a vacuum. Every decision is the product of countless prior causes, shaped by nature, experience, and environment. To believe in absolute free will was to misunderstand the way the world functioned. This deterministic view of human behavior did not mean that morality was irrelevant. On the contrary, it meant that true morality came not from obedience to divine commands but from understanding how best to live in harmony with reality. His ideas did not remain hidden forever. Even in his lifetime, they began to attract attention and controversy. His theological political treatise, published anonymously in 1670, was immediately banned in many places. It was considered so dangerous that even those who agreed with it often hesitated to say so publicly. The book challenged the authority of religious institutions, argued for the separation of church and state, and defended freedom of thought as essential to a functioning society. It laid the groundwork for modern secularism, influencing later thinkers like John Locke, Voltaire, and even the framers of the American Constitution. Yet, despite his growing influence, Spinoza remained a solitary figure. He never sought power, wealth, or public recognition. He lived modestly, refusing prestigious university positions because he feared they would compromise his intellectual independence. He remained committed to his philosophical pursuits until his death in 1677 at the age of 44. Likely from lung disease exacerbated by years of inhaling fine glass particles from his lens-grinding work. He left behind a body of work that would shape the course of modern thought, even though it would take centuries for his ideas to be fully appreciated. His legacy is one of resilience and intellectual courage. He was a man who, when faced with total social rejection, turned inward and found strength in reason. He did not allow exile to break him. Instead, he used it as an opportunity to construct one of the most profound philosophical systems in history. His philosophy remains a powerful antidote to fear, superstition, and blind obedience. It teaches that true freedom is not found in external validation or in the acceptance of comforting illusions, but in the relentless pursuit of understanding. In a world still dominated by ideological rigidity and fear-driven narratives, Spinoza's insights continue to offer a path toward clarity, serenity, and intellectual independence. Spinoza's rejection of absolute free will was one of his most radical and controversial ideas. In a time when most people believed in a God who judged human actions and rewarded or punished accordingly, the idea that human decisions were not made freely but were instead determined by prior causes was deeply unsettling. Spinoza argued that every human action, every thought, every desire was not spontaneous or self-originated but rather the inevitable result of an infinite chain of causes and effects. Just as a stone does not choose to fall but follows the law of gravity, humans do not make choices in isolation from the complex web of natural and psychological influences that shape them. People believe they have free will only because they are aware of their desires but not of the underlying forces that create those desires. This notion challenges the way people typically think about morality, responsibility, and personal identity. If human actions are determined, then what does it mean to be accountable for one's choices? How can justice exist in a world where people do not truly act freely? Spinoza was not suggesting that morality was irrelevant, nor was he saying that people should simply surrender to fate. Rather, he believed that understanding the true nature of human behavior could lead to a more compassionate and rational society. Instead of blaming individuals for their faults as if they had freely chosen to be a certain way, we should recognize that they are the product of countless influences: genetics, upbringing, social environment, education, emotional experiences, and external circumstances. This perspective does not excuse wrongdoing, but it shifts the focus from punishment to understanding. This idea is particularly powerful when applied to emotions like fear. Fear often arises from the illusion that we can or should control everything around us. People experience anxiety about the future because they believe they must shape it according to their desires. They fear failure because they believe success is entirely within their control. They fear rejection because they assume relationships are governed by personal effort rather than a complex mix of compatibility, timing, and external factors. Spinoza's philosophy offers a profound insight. Much of human suffering comes from this mistaken belief in control. People agonize over things that, in reality, could never have unfolded any differently than they did. Imagine someone preparing for a job interview. They might be overwhelmed with anxiety, imagining all the ways they could mess up, thinking that a single mistake will determine their future. But from Spinoza's perspective, this anxiety is based on a false premise. The interview outcome is not a result of sheer willpower. It is determined by an entire network of causes: how well they slept, their past experiences, the mood of the interviewer, even random occurrences like traffic affecting their arrival time. Realizing this does not mean becoming passive or indifferent. It means understanding that while effort matters, it is just one factor in a much larger system of interconnected events. Spinoza's deterministic view also has implications for personal identity. People often believe they can reinvent themselves through sheer willpower, as if they are completely autonomous beings who can break free from their past. But in reality, change is not a matter of simply deciding to be different. It is a slow process influenced by experience, habits, and external conditions. This is why so many New Year's resolutions fail. People assume that willpower alone can override deeply ingrained patterns of behavior, when in truth, real transformation comes from understanding and working within the causal forces that shape us. Instead of willing themselves into new habits, people who succeed in changing their lives do so by modifying their environments, restructuring their thought processes, and gradually shifting their behaviors through consistent practice. One of the biggest fears people have is the fear of death. This fear is deeply rooted in the illusion of control, the idea that life should continue indefinitely, that we can somehow avoid or delay the inevitable. But from Spinoza's perspective, death is simply part of the necessary order of the universe. no different from the way a leaf falls from a tree or wave recedes back into the ocean. To fear death is to misunderstand life itself. Everything exists for a time, and then it transforms into something else. The person who truly understands this does not waste energy resisting the inevitable but instead focuses on living fully within the time they have. Take the example of someone diagnosed with a terminal illness. The natural reaction is fear, grief, and resistance. Why is this happening to me? But Spinoza would say that such emotions arise because we mistakenly see death as an unjust intrusion rather than a natural outcome of existence. A person who accepts Spinoza's perspective might instead spend their remaining time not in denial or despair but in deep appreciation of each moment, understanding that every second is a necessary part of the grand unfolding of nature. Another major source of fear is failure. People assume that their success or failure is entirely within their control. And so when things go wrong, they blame themselves. They replay events in their minds, imagining what they could have done differently, tormenting themselves with what-if scenarios. But Spinoza's determinism suggests that things could not have happened any other way. Every decision a person makes is the result of all the prior experiences, influences, and constraints leading up to that moment. Instead of agonizing over past failures, a person who adopts Spinoza's view would recognize that everything that happened was a necessary result of preceding causes and that dwelling on it serves no practical purpose. Consider an athlete who loses an important competition. They might be devastated, believing that they should have trained harder, made different strategic choices, or pushed themselves beyond their limits. But Spinoza would argue that every factor in that moment, their physical condition, their psychological state, their opponent's performance, was determined by countless preceding events. Instead of seeing the loss as a personal failure, they could view it as part of the inevitable ebb and flow of life, using it as a learning experience rather than a source of self-recrimination. This perspective extends to relationships as well. Many people suffer because they believe they can control how others feel about them. They think that if they say the right things, behave in a certain way, or work hard enough, they can make someone love them, stay loyal, or treat them with kindness. But emotions, like all things, are subject to causality. A breakup, for instance, is not simply the result of one person's failings, it is the outcome of a complex interaction of personalities, circumstances, timing, and external pressures. Understanding this does not remove the pain of loss, but it does prevent the unnecessary suffering that comes from taking complete responsibility for something that was never fully within one's control. Spinoza's rejection of free will does not mean that people are powerless. On the contrary, it means that real power comes from understanding the forces at play and working with them rather than against them. A person who understands the causes of their emotions is less likely to be ruled by them. A person who recognizes that failure is not a personal shortcoming but a necessary part of growth is less likely to be paralyzed by fear. A person who accepts that life unfolds according to natural laws, rather than arbitrary divine will, is more likely to live with peace and clarity. The implications of this way of thinking are profound. It changes how we view success and failure, love and loss, joy and sorrow. It teaches us to approach life not with resistance, but with acceptance, instead of seeing ourselves as isolated individuals making choices in a vacuum. We begin to see ourselves as part of a vast and intricate system, moving according to the same principles that govern the stars, the seasons, and the tides. In this view, fear loses its grip, anxiety fades. What remains is a deep and abiding sense of peace, the kind of peace that comes from knowing that everything is exactly as it must be. Spinoza's perspective on emotions challenges the traditional notion that feelings like fear, anger, and sadness are enemies that must be suppressed or eradicated. Instead, he viewed emotions as signals, messages from the mind that indicate how we are interpreting the world around us. Emotions, in this sense, are neither inherently good nor bad. They simply reflect the way we understand and interact with reality. The problem arises not from the emotions themselves but from our failure to understand their origins and influence over our actions. Take fear, for example. Fear is often viewed as a paralyzing force, something that prevents people from taking risks, speaking up, or stepping outside their comfort zones. A person who is terrified of public speaking might believe that their fear is an unavoidable part of who they are, something that must be fought against or ignored. But Spinoza would argue that this fear is not an arbitrary emotion, it arises from a specific chain of thoughts and associations. Perhaps the person fears being judged, embarrassing themselves, or failing to meet expectations. These fears do not exist in isolation, they are shaped by past experiences, societal pressures, and personal insecurities. Rather than trying to suppress fear, Spinoza believed the key was to examine it with reason. Instead of reacting instinctively, one should analyze its cause. Why do I fear public speaking? What exactly am I afraid will happen? Breaking down the fear into logical components allows a person to recognize that much of their anxiety is based on assumptions rather than reality. Maybe they believe that if they make a mistake, everyone will ridicule them. But is this actually true? Have they ever seen an audience react with hostility to a speaker who stumbled over their words? More often than not, people are sympathetic and forget minor mistakes quickly. When the mind starts to replace vague fears with concrete analysis, emotions lose their overwhelming power. Anger functions in a similar way. Many people see anger as a destructive force, something that leads to conflict, resentment, and irrational behavior. But Spinoza saw it as a reaction to perceived injustice or frustration. A person does not become angry for no reason. Their anger is a response to something they believe has violated their sense of fairness or personal dignity. The key, then, is not to suppress anger but to understand why it arises. Suppose someone gets cut off in traffic and immediately feels a surge of rage. If they stop and analyze their anger, they might realize that their frustration comes from a sense of personal offense. This person disrespected me. They acted as if their time was more valuable than mine. But does this interpretation actually serve any purpose? Did the other driver intentionally set out to insult them? Or were they simply distracted or in a rush? By reframing anger in this way, a person can begin to detach from their emotional impulses. Instead of feeling personally attacked, they might see the situation as an impersonal event, a moment in a long chain of cause and effect, rather than a deliberate slight. This does not mean suppressing anger entirely, rather, it means using reason to redirect it. If the goal is to prevent reckless driving, then channeling that energy into advocacy for better road safety might be a more productive response than stewing in resentment. Sadness, too, can be examined in the same way. Many people fall into despair when they experience loss, rejection, or failure. They interpret these events as reflections of their own worth. I was rejected because I am not good enough. I failed because I am incapable. But Spinoza would argue that this interpretation is flawed. Failure and rejection are not absolute verdicts on a person's value. They are simply events shaped by countless external factors. A person who did not get a job they applied for might assume that they were not talented enough. But the reality could be far more complex. Perhaps the employer was looking for a specific skill set, or maybe the company was undergoing internal restructuring. Understanding this removes the emotional sting of rejection. Instead of internalizing failure as a reflection of self-worth, a person can view it as a neutral event, one that provides information rather than condemnation. Consider the example of an entrepreneur who starts a business, only to see it collapse within a year. Their first instinct might be to take the failure personally, to see it as evidence that they are not cut out for success. But if they analyze the situation rationally, they might discover that the failure was not due to their personal shortcomings but rather due to poor market timing, economic conditions, or insufficient resources. Instead of falling into despair, they can use this knowledge to make better decisions in the future. Understanding the cause and effect nature of failure allows people to detach their emotions from the event itself. This way of thinking is not just useful for individuals, it has profound societal implications. Many conflicts, both personal and political, arise because people allow emotions to dictate their responses rather than reason. Political debates often become heated because people feel personally attacked when their beliefs are challenged. Instead of calmly examining opposing viewpoints, they react with hostility, seeing disagreement as an existential threat rather than an opportunity for learning. Spinoza's approach would suggest that rather than reacting emotionally, people should take a step back and ask, why do I feel threatened? Is my belief being challenged? Or is my identity wrapped up in this belief? The ability to detach from emotional reflexes in favor of rational analysis leads to more productive discussions and less division. Spinoza's insights also apply to relationships. Many personal conflicts arise not from actual wrongdoing but from emotional misinterpretation. A person might feel neglected by a friend who has not reached out in a while and assume that the friend no longer cares about them. But if they step back and analyze the situation logically, they might recognize that the friend could be dealing with their own stress at work, personal issues, or health problems. Instead of reacting with resentment, they can respond with understanding, preventing unnecessary emotional suffering. At its core, Spinoza's philosophy teaches that emotions are not the enemy. They are essential components of human experience, but they should not be allowed to dictate actions blindly. By examining emotions through the lens of reason, people can transform them from sources of suffering into tools for growth and understanding. Fear becomes an opportunity to confront false assumptions. Anger becomes a signal that something feels unjust and requires thoughtful action. Sadness becomes a moment of reflection rather than despair. This does not mean that emotions should be ignored or dismissed. On the contrary, Spinoza believed that true mastery over one's emotions came not from suppression but from comprehension. A person who understands their own emotions is not controlled by them. They do not react impulsively to every surge of fear, anger, or sadness. Instead, they recognize these feelings as part of the complex interplay between thought and reality. They observe them, analyze them, and use them as guides rather than obstacles. Modern psychology echoes many of these insights. Cognitive behavioral therapy (CBT), one of the most effective forms of therapy today, is built on principles similar to Spinoza's. CBT teaches individuals to identify distorted thinking patterns, challenge irrational beliefs, and replace them with more accurate interpretations of reality. Someone who suffers from social anxiety, for example, might assume that everyone is judging them harshly. But by analyzing this belief logically, they can recognize that most people are too preoccupied with their own concerns to scrutinize others so closely. This shift in perspective reduces anxiety and allows for healthier social interactions. Spinoza's approach to emotions is not about denying human nature but about elevating it. When people understand the true causes of their feelings, they gain the ability to respond rather than simply react. This creates a sense of inner stability and emotional resilience that is not easily shaken by external events. Instead of being thrown into turmoil by every perceived slight, failure, or uncertainty, a person who applies Spinoza's philosophy remains centered, grounded in reason rather than swept away by impulse. In daily life, this perspective can be applied to almost any situation. When facing rejection, instead of spiraling into self-doubt, one can step back and analyze the bigger picture. When feeling anger towards someone, instead of lashing out, one can pause and examine whether the anger is truly justified or if it is based on a misinterpretation. When experiencing fear, one can ask whether the fear is based on real danger or on hypothetical worries that may never come to pass. By integrating these principles into everyday thinking, people can gain a greater sense of peace and control over their lives. Instead of being at the mercy of emotions, they can use them as valuable information guides that help them navigate the world with clarity and purpose. This is the essence of Spinoza's vision: a life where reason and emotion are not enemies, but allies in the pursuit of wisdom and fulfillment. Fear is an intrinsic part of human existence, shaping decisions, behaviors, and even long-term aspirations. However, Spinoza argued that fear is not an inescapable force but a product of misunderstanding the way reality operates. He proposed 3 fundamental principles to help individuals transcend fear: observing emotions objectively without immediate reaction, using reason to analyze reality rather than allowing emotions to distort perception, and accepting what cannot be changed instead of resisting reality. These principles serve as a guide for navigating fear in a way that leads to clarity, resilience, and a more balanced state of mind. The first step is to observe emotions objectively, without judgment or immediate reaction. Fear, like all emotions, arises as a response to stimuli, but the problem lies in how people interpret and respond to it. When faced with fear, many react impulsively, either avoiding the situation entirely or succumbing to panic. This reaction is often driven by deeply ingrained psychological conditioning. For example, someone who experiences anxiety before a public speaking event might immediately assume they are incapable of handling the situation, reinforcing their fear through avoidance. Spinoza would argue that instead of immediately reacting to fear, one should take a step back and simply observe it. What does this fear feel like? Where does it originate? Does it have a tangible basis? Or is it an automatic response to uncertainty? A relatable example of this is test anxiety. A student preparing for an important exam may experience a surge of fear, interpreting it as a sign that they are unprepared. However, if they pause and examine their fear objectively, they might realize that the anxiety is not proof of inadequacy but merely an automatic reaction to the pressure of evaluation. If they do not immediately react by spiraling into negative thoughts, they create space to respond more rationally. Instead of feeding into panic, they can acknowledge the emotion and use it as motivation to focus on studying. This practice of observation without immediate reaction helps break the cycle of fear-driven avoidance, allowing individuals to interact with their emotions in a more constructive way. The second principle is to use reason to analyze the truth rather than letting emotions distort reality. Emotions are powerful but often misleading. Fear, in particular, tends to amplify threats, making them seem more imminent or catastrophic than they truly are. Spinoza argued that people suffer not because of external events but because of the way they interpret them. A key to overcoming fear is to question its validity. Does the threat truly exist? Or is the mind exaggerating its severity? This principle aligns with modern cognitive behavioral therapy, which teaches individuals to challenge irrational thoughts by examining evidence. Consider someone afraid of flying. Statistically, air travel is one of the safest modes of transportation, yet their fear convinces them that stepping onto an airplane is an immediate danger. Spinoza's method would suggest breaking this fear down logically. What is the actual probability of an accident? How many successful flights occur daily? Have they personally ever been in a situation where their fear materialized? By replacing emotional exaggeration with objective reasoning, they reduce the grip of fear and regain control over their perception of reality. This principle applies to social fears as well. Many people fear rejection, whether in relationships, job applications, or creative pursuits. They assume that a single rejection is a definitive statement about their worth. However, using reason, they can analyze the situation differently. Did they truly fail, or was the outcome influenced by factors beyond their control? Was their rejection a reflection of their abilities, or simply a mismatch between circumstances? By thinking critically rather than emotionally, they shift from a fear-driven mindset to a rational one, making fear less of an obstacle. The final principle is accepting what cannot be changed rather than resisting reality. Much of human suffering arises from a refusal to accept the inevitable. People want control over circumstances that are inherently uncontrollable, and when reality does not conform to their expectations, they experience frustration and fear. Spinoza saw this resistance as futile, instead of struggling against what cannot be altered. He advocated for adaptation. Take the aging process as an example. Many people fear aging because it represents a loss of youth, beauty, or vitality. This fear leads to constant efforts to resist time-excessive cosmetic procedures, anxiety over physical changes, and denial of the natural aging process. But aging, like all natural phenomena, follows a necessary order. Spinoza's philosophy suggests that instead of fighting against it, one should embrace it as a part of life's continuous transformation. By accepting the inevitability of aging, people free themselves from the fear associated with it and focus on what they can control: health, mindset, and meaningful experiences. Another example is dealing with loss. The death of a loved one, the end of a relationship, or the collapse of a career can be devastating. Many respond by resisting reality, refusing to accept that change has occurred, or dwelling on what could have been different. This resistance prolongs suffering because it traps individuals in a state of denial. Spinoza's philosophy suggests that instead of resisting, one should acknowledge loss as a natural part of existence. By accepting what has happened, people open themselves to new perspectives, healing, and growth. Applying these three principles: objective observation of emotions, rational analysis of reality, and acceptance of the inevitable, creates a profound shift in how individuals relate to fear. Instead of being controlled by it, they develop the ability to navigate it with clarity. They learn to recognize that emotions, though powerful, do not define reality. They see that many fears are built on distorted perceptions rather than actual threats. And most importantly, they stop wasting energy resisting things that are beyond their control, redirecting their focus toward meaningful action. This approach is evident in successful individuals across various fields. Athletes, for example, do not let the fear of losing prevent them from competing. They train their minds to see failure not as something to fear but as a necessary part of improvement. Entrepreneurs do not let the fear of financial risk stop them from pursuing innovation. They understand that setbacks are inevitable and that resilience comes from adapting rather than resisting. Artists do not let the fear of criticism paralyze them. They accept that not everyone will appreciate their work but create nonetheless because expression is more valuable than approval. Fear loses its power when it is met with understanding rather than avoidance. A person who applies these principles does not become fearless in the traditional sense, rather, they develop a different relationship with fear. They do not let it dictate their actions or cloud their judgment. They acknowledge it, analyze it, and ultimately move beyond it. This is the essence of Spinoza's philosophy, a way of engaging with life not from a place of fear, but from a place of wisdom and acceptance. By practicing these principles consistently, fear ceases to be an obstacle and instead becomes a tool for growth. People stop reacting impulsively and start responding thoughtfully. They stop seeing uncertainty as a threat and start viewing it as an opportunity for deeper understanding. They stop wasting energy on things they cannot change and begin investing it in things they can. The result is a life that is not dictated by fear but guided by reason, resilience, and a deep sense of inner peace. Happiness, according to Spinoza, is not found in controlling every aspect of life but in understanding and aligning oneself with the natural order of the universe. People often equate happiness with achieving specific goals, avoiding pain, and ensuring that everything unfolds according to their desires. However, this mindset inevitably leads to disappointment because the world does not conform to individual expectations. Spinoza argued that true happiness comes not from bending reality to one's will but from recognizing the fundamental laws that govern existence and embracing them rather than resisting them. This idea closely aligns with both Buddhism and Stoicism, two philosophies that also emphasize acceptance of reality as the key to inner peace. In Buddhism, suffering is said to arise from attachment, clinging to things as though they should be permanent when, in fact, all things are transient. When people expect stability in relationships, financial security, or perfect health, they set themselves up for suffering because life is inherently uncertain. By practicing detachment and understanding the impermanence of all things, a person can find contentment regardless of external circumstances. Similarly, Stoicism teaches that suffering is not caused by events themselves but by how people interpret those events. A Stoic does not view hardship as a punishment but as an opportunity to exercise virtue, to strengthen their character, and to cultivate wisdom. Spinoza's philosophy echoes these ideas by emphasizing that understanding necessity leads to freedom. Once a person sees that everything unfolds according to natural laws, they stop wasting energy fighting what they cannot change and instead focus on how best to navigate reality. A powerful real-world example of this mindset is Nelson Mandela, who spent 27 years in prison under brutal conditions yet emerged not with bitterness but with a deep sense of purpose and wisdom. Most people, when faced with prolonged imprisonment, would fall into despair, rage, or resentment. The natural instinct is to resist, to curse fate, and to dwell on the injustice of it all. But Mandela, much like Spinoza, recognized that suffering comes not from circumstances themselves but from how one responds to them. Instead of seeing his imprisonment as the destruction of his life, he reframed it as an opportunity. He used his time in prison to reflect, to educate himself, and to build resilience. He realized that while he could not control his external conditions, he had full control over his mind and his reactions. This is the essence of Spinoza's philosophy. True freedom is not about changing the world to fit your desires but about changing your mindset to align with the nature of reality. The idea that happiness comes from understanding rather than control can be applied to countless aspects of life. Relationships, for example, often cause immense suffering because people try to control how others feel about them. They seek validation, fear rejection, and expect their partners or friends to behave in specific ways. But relationships, like everything else, are governed by natural laws. People change, emotions fluctuate, and external circumstances influence interactions in ways that no one can predict or command. A person who understands this does not try to force love or friendship but instead appreciates connections for what they are. Accepting that some relationships last while others fade. They do not suffer unnecessarily when things do not go as expected because they recognize that impermanence is part of life. Career ambitions follow a similar pattern. Many believe that their happiness depends on achieving success in their chosen field. Earning a certain amount of money, or gaining recognition, they tie their self-worth to external achievements, believing that once they reach a particular milestone, they will finally be content. But life is unpredictable. Economic downturns, shifts in industry demand, unexpected setbacks, all of these factors influence success in ways that are often beyond personal control. A person who internalizes Spinoza's perspective does not let these uncertainties dictate their emotional state. They strive for success, but they do not attach their happiness to it. If they face failure, they do not see it as a personal defeat but as part of the necessary order of things. They learn, adapt, and move forward with a sense of peace. Health is another area where people often struggle with control. Illness and aging are inevitable, yet many people live in constant fear of them. They try to fight the aging process with endless treatments, worry obsessively about potential diseases, and struggle against the body's natural changes. But Spinoza's philosophy suggests that peace comes from accepting the nature of existence. Instead of fearing aging, a person who embraces Spinoza's view would see it as a natural progression, something to be appreciated rather than resisted. They would focus on what they can control, maintaining a healthy lifestyle, enjoying meaningful experiences while letting go of anxiety over what is beyond their power. This mindset extends to dealing with loss, whether it is the death of a loved one, the end of a phase in life, or the loss of an opportunity. Suffering often arises from an inability to accept what has already happened. Many people dwell on what could have been, replaying scenarios in their minds and wishing things had gone differently. But Spinoza would argue that this is an exercise in futility. The past cannot be changed, and resisting reality only creates unnecessary suffering. A person who understands this does not deny grief but allows it to pass naturally, without adding layers of resentment or regret. They do not resist the flow of life but move with it, finding peace in understanding that everything occurs as it must. A key benefit of this approach is that it liberates people from the illusion that happiness is something to be attained in the future. Many believe that they will be happy once they reach a certain goal, once they buy a house, get a promotion, find the perfect partner, or retire. But happiness is not a destination. It is a state of being that comes from aligning with reality as it is. A person who understands Spinoza's philosophy realizes that there is no need to wait for external conditions to be perfect. Happiness is available now, in the present moment, through understanding, acceptance, and appreciation of what is. Modern psychology supports many of these ideas. Studies on happiness consistently show that people who practice gratitude, mindfulness, and acceptance experience greater well-being than those who constantly chase external validation. Mindfulness, in particular, mirrors Spinoza's emphasis on awareness by observing thoughts and emotions without attachment. Individuals free themselves from unnecessary suffering. Instead of being caught up in worries about the future or regrets about the past, they focus on what they can control, their perspective. Spinoza's view is not about passivity or resignation. It does not mean people should stop striving for improvement or accepting injustice. Rather, it means understanding what is within one's control and what is not. It means acting with wisdom, making choices that align with reason, and letting go of unnecessary struggles against reality. When people embrace this philosophy, they live with a sense of ease, knowing that they are part of a greater order, one that is neither cruel nor arbitrary but simply follows its own natural course. The practical application of this philosophy is profound. Someone facing career setbacks does not fall into despair but adapts and seeks new opportunities. Someone dealing with personal loss does not resist grief but allows it to unfold naturally without unnecessary suffering. Someone who desires success does not attach their entire self-worth to achievement but enjoys the process of growth itself. By shifting the focus from control to understanding, people free themselves from the anxiety and frustration that come from expecting life to conform to personal desires. In everyday life, this perspective allows people to appreciate moments as they come, instead of constantly longing for more. They find joy in simple things: a conversation with a friend, a moment of stillness, a task well done. They stop seeing life as a series of obstacles to overcome and instead view it as an unfolding journey. One that is neither good nor bad but simply is. By accepting the nature of existence, they experience a deep and lasting sense of peace. This is what Spinoza meant by happiness: not fleeting pleasure, not the fulfillment of every desire, but a profound state of harmony with reality. When people stop fighting against life and instead align themselves with its natural flow, they discover that the happiness they were seeking was never in external circumstances but in the clarity of understanding itself. Spinoza lived a life that, by most external standards, seemed devoid of power, wealth, or recognition. He was not a ruler, a celebrated scholar of his time, or a man with great social influence. In fact, he was excommunicated from his own religious community, rejected by the very people he grew up with, and lived in near isolation, grinding lenses to make a modest living. Yet, despite all of this, he achieved something that few ever do: an unshakable internal freedom. He did not need the validation of society, nor did he require material success to affirm his worth. His mind was his domain, and by understanding the fundamental nature of existence, he freed himself from the illusions that enslave most people. One of the most profound aspects of Spinoza's philosophy is his understanding of fear. Most people live in a state of constant anxiety, reacting to external events as if they have total control over them. They fear failure, rejection, and loss, believing that these experiences define them. But Spinoza saw fear for what it truly is: a product of misunderstanding reality. When people cling to the idea that they must control everything, they inevitably suffer when the world does not conform to their expectations. By deeply comprehending the deterministic nature of existence, he realized that suffering is not caused by events themselves but by the way the mind interprets them. Once a person understands that everything follows natural laws, fear loses its grip. Imagine someone who is constantly worried about losing their job. They stress over every decision, worry about office politics, and live in fear of what might happen if they are laid off. But if they were to adopt Spinoza's perspective, they would recognize that their employment status is determined by a multitude of factors: economic conditions, company decisions, and societal trends, many of which are beyond their control. Instead of being consumed by anxiety, they would focus on what they can control: their skills, their adaptability, and their mindset. By removing the illusion that they must control every aspect of their career, they free themselves from unnecessary fear. This applies not only to work but to relationships as well. Many people fear being alone, believing that their happiness depends on being loved by someone else. They stay in unhealthy relationships because they are terrified of rejection or loneliness. But if they understood Spinoza's insight, they would see that relationships, like everything else, follow natural laws. People change, circumstances evolve, and connections form and dissolve. Clinging to the idea that a specific person must always be in their life creates suffering. Instead of fearing loss, they could learn to appreciate relationships as they unfold, without the desperate need for control. Love, in Spinoza's view, is not about possession but about understanding and harmony. This kind of intellectual liberation does not mean passivity. It does not mean surrendering to fate and making no effort to shape one's life. On the contrary, it means taking action with clarity rather than desperation. A person who understands Spinoza's philosophy does not stop striving for success. But they do not define themselves by it. They do not stop seeking meaningful relationships. But they do not allow rejection to shatter their sense of self. They do not ignore challenges. But they do not fear them either. They move through life with a sense of peace, knowing that whatever happens is part of a larger order that they may not always understand but can always accept. The ultimate question is whether people are willing to embrace this way of thinking. It is easy to live in fear because fear is reinforced by the world around us. Media thrives on sensationalism, making people believe that danger lurks around every corner. Social structures encourage people to compare themselves to others, fueling anxiety about success, appearance, and worth. Religion, at least in its more dogmatic forms, often instills fear of divine punishment or moral failure. To break free from fear requires a fundamental shift in perspective. It requires the courage to think differently, To see reality as it is rather than how society conditions us to see it. This is the challenge that Spinoza's philosophy presents. Are you willing to live without fear? Are you willing to accept that not everything is in your control? Are you ready to stop fighting reality and instead understand it? For most, this is a terrifying thought because it means letting go of the illusions that provide a false sense of security. But for those who embrace it, the reward is immense. It is a life where anxiety no longer dictates choices, where suffering is not amplified by resistance, and where freedom is found not in external circumstances but in the mind itself. Consider how different life would be if people stopped fearing failure, if they pursued their passions without the crippling worry of whether they would succeed or not, if they spoke their minds without being paralyzed by the fear of judgment, if they embraced change rather than resisted it. This is not just abstract philosophy, it is a way of being that has practical, tangible benefits. The entrepreneur who is not afraid to fail is more likely to innovate. The artist who is not afraid of criticism is more likely to create something original. The individual who is not afraid of rejection is more likely to build deep, authentic relationships. When fear no longer rules, life opens up in ways that are impossible when the mind is shackled by anxiety. Even history provides examples of individuals who have embodied this mindset. Nelson Mandela, after spending decades in prison, emerged without resentment but with wisdom and purpose. He did not allow fear or bitterness to control him. Instead, he focused on what he could do: unite his country, seek reconciliation, and move forward with clarity. The Stoics, from Marcus Aurelius to Epictetus, embraced the same principles, recognizing that suffering comes not from external events but from the way they are perceived. Spinoza's insights align with these figures, reinforcing the idea that true strength comes not from controlling the world but from understanding it. One of the most liberating aspects of this philosophy is that it applies to everyone. It does not matter where a person is born, what circumstances they face, or what their past has been. Anyone can cultivate this mindset. It is not dependent on wealth, social status, or intelligence. It is simply a matter of seeing the world clearly and choosing to respond with wisdom rather than fear. This is why Spinoza, despite being isolated and unrecognized in his time, achieved a level of freedom that even the most powerful rulers of history could never attain. Kings and emperors may have commanded armies and controlled nations, but they were often prisoners of their own fears: fear of losing power, fear of betrayal, fear of death. Spinoza, with nothing but his thoughts, was freer than all of them. The real question is whether people are ready to embrace this freedom. It is not easy. It requires unlearning much of what society teaches. It demands a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. It asks people to step outside their conditioned ways of thinking and see reality as it is. But for those who do, life changes in profound ways. Anxiety diminishes, resilience grows, and peace becomes the default state rather than a fleeting emotion. This is the essence of Spinoza's message: not to seek happiness in control, but to find it in understanding, not to chase illusions of certainty, but to embrace the reality of existence, not to fear the unknown, but to see it as part of the endless, necessary unfolding of the universe. Most people will continue to live as they always have, ruled by their fears, dictated by external events, and trapped in cycles of anxiety. But for those who are willing to see, to think, and to embrace the truth, there is a different way to live. A way that does not depend on wealth, status, or external validation. A way that is not shaken by failure, loss, or uncertainty. A way that is rooted in knowledge, clarity, and acceptance. The choice is always there. The question is, will you take it? So now you know. Fear is not what you thought it was. It is not an unavoidable force, not something you are doomed to live with forever. It is a construct, a misunderstanding, an illusion that fades when you learn to see reality for what it truly is. Spinoza understood that fear only thrives in ignorance. The moment you replace fear with knowledge, with understanding, with acceptance of what is, you become untouchable. Imagine living a life where setbacks don't break you, where the opinions of others no longer shape your self-worth, where uncertainty excites you rather than terrifies you. That is the life Spinoza found. That is the life you can have if you choose to embrace it. The world teaches us to be afraid. Society thrives on keeping us anxious, uncertain, and desperate for approval. The media feeds off our fears. The economy profits from our insecurities. And institutions rely on our need for control. But the truth is, real control comes not from forcing the world to bend to your will but from understanding it so deeply that you no longer need to resist. The question is, will you take that step? Will you challenge the way you've always thought? Will you let go of fear and live with clarity and wisdom? Or will you keep letting fear make your choices for you? The answer is yours to decide. If this video resonated with you, do me a favor, hit that like button so more people can find this message. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, because this is just the beginning. And if you want to support this work and keep these ideas alive, consider donating through Super Thanks. Every contribution helps us keep making content that empowers and inspires. Remember, knowledge is power, but only if you use it. Fear loses its grip the moment you decide to take control of your mind. So go out there and live, not in fear, but in understanding. See you in the next video.